The world just handed you a live lesson in how fast everything you thought was stable can vanish. And most people still don't understand the full weight of what's happening right now in those 21 miles of water called the Strait of Hormuz. Because this isn't just a naval skirmish, this isn't just Iran firing on ships. What the International Energy Agency has officially characterized as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market is unfolding in real time, and the consequences are already crawling into your grocery bill, your gas pump, and the very foundation of the global order that the United States has spent 7 decades building and defending. So let's slow this down and talk about what's really happening. Not the headlines, not the spin, but the structural reality beneath all of it. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched an air war against Iran, assassinating its supreme leader Ali Khamenei in the process. In retaliation, Iran launched missile and drone attacks on Israel, US military bases, and US allied Gulf states. And then Iran did something that every serious geopolitical analyst had warned about for decades. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard closed the Strait of Hormuz. And when they closed it, they didn't just close a waterway. They pulled the pin on a grenade that had been sitting in the middle of the global economy for years. Before this crisis, the Strait of Hormuz carried around a quarter of global seaborne oil trade and significant volumes of liquefied natural gas and fertilizers. Ship transits dropped from around 130 per day in February to just 6 in March, a collapse of about 95%. Think about that number for a moment. 95%, that is not a disruption. That is a near-total shutdown of one of the most consequential arteries of human civilization. And the economic shockwave from that shutdown is still expanding outward, reaching places and people who couldn't even point to the Strait of Hormuz on a map. Oil prices gyrated wildly since the strikes began, with disruptions to Middle Eastern supplies and the cessation of tanker traffic through the strait sending Brent futures soaring, trading within a whisker of $120 per barrel. And that's the futures market, the paper market, the hedged and managed number that institutions use to communicate risk to each other in controlled settings. The physical crude oil prices surged to record levels near $150 per barrel, far above the prices in futures markets, with the physical futures disconnect becoming increasingly acute. Even steeper gains have been seen for refined products, with middle distillate prices in Singapore reaching all-time highs above $290 per barrel. When the physical price of a commodity disconnects from the futures price that dramatically, it means the real world is in a state of genuine scarcity. The paper promises and the actual barrels are no longer telling the same story, and that is a deeply alarming signal for anyone who understands how commodity markets actually function. Global oil supply plummeted by 10.1 million barrels per day, with continued attacks on energy infrastructure in the Middle East and ongoing restrictions to tanker movements through the strait leading to the largest disruption in history. OPEC Plus production fell 9.4 million barrels per day, month over month, 10 million barrels a day. Gone. Just like that. The world was consuming roughly 102 million barrels of oil per day before this crisis. A 10 million barrel per day shortfall is roughly a 10% loss of global supply, essentially overnight. And unlike a factory that can restart production quickly, oil infrastructure that gets damaged, shut in, or denied export routes takes months and sometimes years to come back online at full capacity. Now here is where people need to pay very close attention because the story gets darker and it gets personal very quickly. The Persian Gulf is a major hub for global fertilizer production and exports. In the 2020s, the region has accounted for roughly 30 to 35% of global urea exports and around 20 to 30% of ammonia exports. Overall, up to 30% of internationally traded fertilizers normally transit the Strait of Hormuz. Most people hear fertilizer and they think of something abstract, farming, agriculture, far away from their daily life. But fertilizer is what produces food. Without it, yields collapse. And when yields collapse, prices rise. And when prices rise, the people who are already spending the largest proportion of their incomes on food are the first ones to feel it, and they feel it badly. Urea prices increased by 50% since the start of the war as of late March 2026, while other fertilizer prices also rose. The price shock and the shortage of fertilizer during the spring planting season could reduce the planting and yields of corn in the US, the main feedstock for US beef, poultry, and dairy, and potentially increase global food prices into 2027. Read that again: US corn, US beef, US poultry, US dairy. The Hormuz crisis is not just a Middle East problem. It is marching directly toward the American dinner table, and the timeline extends well into next year. These are not speculative projections. These are the assessments of energy and agricultural economists who have access to real supply chain data. Beyond energy, the conflict is disrupting key non-oil commodities like methanol, aluminium, sulfur, and graphite, impacting global manufacturing and the green energy transition. Disruptions to these industrial essentials are rapidly reshaping global supply chains, from fertilizers for future harvests to minerals driving high-tech industries. Sulfur, which most people have never thought about once in their lives, is a byproduct of oil and gas refining in the Gulf, and it feeds directly into sulfuric acid production, which is essential for processing the metals that go into electric vehicle batteries and renewable energy storage. The irony of a crisis that simultaneously threatens fossil fuel supply while also damaging the infrastructure needed to build its supposed replacements is almost too perfect. The green energy transition doesn't get a free pass from a Hormuz crisis. It gets hit just as hard, if not harder, because it depends on the same supply chains. The conflict has echoed the 1970s energy crisis through acute supply shortages, currency volatility, inflation, and heightened risks of stagflation and recession. Interest rate reductions were expected to be postponed or conversely increased in light of higher inflation caused by supply shortages and speculation. Stock markets experienced declines globally, and there was a global bonds market sell-off. The 1970s comparison is not just rhetorical, it is structural. What happened in 1973 and 1979 when Arab oil embargoes hit the West was a revelation of just how deeply the modern economy had wired itself into cheap, accessible fossil fuel. And when that assumption got violated, the whole system lurched. Inflation, recession, political upheaval, changes in government. The United States that emerged from the 1970s energy crisis was a different country from the one that entered it. We may be looking at a similar kind of inflection point right now. Global growth is expected to slow from 2.9% in 2025 to 2.6% in 2026, assuming the conflict does not intensify further. If the situation persists, disruptions to trade and financial markets could deepen, increasing the risk of a broader cascading crisis. And here's the key phrase right there: assuming the conflict does not intensify further, because the conflict has in fact continued to intensify. Since April 13th, the US has blockaded Iranian ports, leading to what's being described as a dual blockade of the Strait. You now have Iran blockading the Gulf from one direction and the United States blockading Iranian ports from the other direction. Two nuclear-capable powers are engaged in simultaneous economic warfare through one of the world's most irreplaceable maritime choke points. The word cascading in that UNCTAD report should be taken seriously. Cascading crises are not linear, they do not scale up predictably. They jump across systems and sectors in ways that models cannot fully anticipate. For officials in Washington, the main points of contention remain control over the Strait of Hormuz and the future of Iran's nuclear program. And this is where the geopolitical chess game reveals itself to be far more complicated than most American media coverage suggests, because Iran's willingness to absorb the destruction of its supreme leader, absorb airstrikes on its nuclear facilities, absorb economic sanctions, and still control the Strait of Hormuz, still fire on ships, still board vessels, still lay mines, tells you something very important about how Tehran is calculating this confrontation. They are not backing down. And they have a very specific reason for that. Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf said reopening the Strait of Hormuz is impossible as long as the US blockade is in place. This is the nature of the trap. Each side is using economic leverage to demand concessions from the other, and each side's leverage depends on the other side remaining in pain. The United States wants the Strait open and Iran's nuclear program dismantled. Iran wants the blockade lifted and its sovereignty recognized. These are not positions that easily split the difference. And in the meantime, every day that the standoff continues, more billions evaporate from the global economy, more ships sit idle, more tankers reroute or don't sail at all, and more families around the world pay more for energy and food. China and Russia vetoed a draft UN Security Council resolution on the Strait of Hormuz. The Bahraini drafted resolution called for an end to Iranian attacks and for states to coordinate defensive efforts for shipping access, including escorts for ships. However, China has called on freedom of navigation in the Strait to be guaranteed as the shared call of the international community. The diplomatic hypocrisy here is breathtaking and worth sitting with. China publicly calls for freedom of navigation, the same principle it routinely violates in the South China Sea, while simultaneously vetoing the very resolution that would enforce freedom of navigation in Hormuz. Why? Because a China that refuses to openly support Iran can still benefit enormously from Iran's disruption of Western-aligned energy markets. Russia benefits too. The crisis has pushed up global oil and gas prices, benefiting both Russia and, temporarily, Iran. Moscow is watching from a position of quiet advantage. Every barrel that cannot leave the Gulf through Hormuz is a barrel that makes Russian oil more valuable, more necessary, more irreplaceable to the Asian and European buyers scrambling to find alternative supply. Iran has appointed Khamenei's son as his successor and launched a series of counterstrikes against Israel, U.S. military bases in the region, and military and civilian locations in Arab states. The Iranian warnings and subsequent attacks on vessels prompted shipping firms to suspend operations in the strait. And this succession dynamic is something that has received very little analysis in mainstream Western coverage. A new supreme leader who inherits power in the middle of a war with the United States under conditions of maximum national humiliation has every political incentive to demonstrate strength and resolve. He cannot afford to appear weak. He cannot afford to give ground quickly without extracting significant concessions. The political logic inside Tehran actually pushes toward escalation, not de-escalation, regardless of the economic devastation being imposed. Iran's attacks on oil tankers before the ceasefire led to a plunge in traffic through the strait, triggering what's been described as the largest oil supply disruption in history. It will take until July for oil flows to reach up to 90% of pre-war levels and up to another 2 months for barrels to arrive at refineries around the world for processing into products, according to Rystad Energy. This is the timeline that almost no one is talking about clearly enough. Even if a peace deal were signed tomorrow, and there is no sign of that, the supply chain damage already inflicted extends through the summer and into the fall. There is a lag between geopolitical resolution and economic relief that is baked into the physics of oil supply chains. Tankers need to sail, refineries need feedstock, product needs to travel to market. That whole chain, once broken, takes time to rebuild itself. The maritime blockade triggered a concurrent grocery supply emergency across Gulf Cooperation Council states, which rely on the strait for over 80% of their caloric intake. By mid-March, 70% of the region's food imports were disrupted, forcing retailers to airlift staples, resulting in a 40 to 120% spike in consumer prices. Countries like Kuwait and Qatar import almost everything they eat through the Strait of Hormuz. The cereal that arrives in Kuwait passes through Hormuz. The rice that gets offloaded in Doha passes through Hormuz. The crisis has also shifted toward fears of a humanitarian crisis following Iranian strikes on desalination plants, the source of 99% of drinking water in Kuwait and Qatar. This is the moment where the geopolitical crisis transforms into a potential humanitarian catastrophe. A country without food is in crisis. A country without water is in collapse. These are not abstractions. These are real people, millions of them, in countries that the United States has treated as allies facing the cascading consequences of a war that was launched in their neighborhood. The IEA's executive director has said the combined impacts amount to the greatest threat to global energy security in history. And yet, despite all of this, the framing in much of the American media coverage has been remarkably narrow, focused on ceasefire extensions, diplomatic meetings, Trump's statements, Iran's statements, the back and forth of negotiating positions. What gets lost in that framing is the structural reality underneath. What gets lost is the fact that the global economic architecture built around the free flow of energy through the Persian Gulf has been fundamentally challenged in a way it has never been challenged before, not by the 1973 embargo, not by the 1979 revolution, not by the 2019 tanker attacks. Nothing in the post-war history of the global oil market comes close to what is happening right now in terms of the scale and speed of the disruption. The de facto closure of the Strait of Hormuz and damage to regional infrastructure have produced the largest disruption to the global oil market in its history, according to the International Energy Agency. For fuel importing economies, the effect is that of a large, sudden tax on income. That is the cleanest and most precise economic description of what this crisis means for ordinary Americans, ordinary Europeans, ordinary Asians. It is a tax, unlegislated, unanticipated, and unrecoverable through any conventional policy tool. When you pay more at the gas pump, when you pay more at the grocery store, when the airline ticket costs more because jet fuel costs more, when the Amazon package costs more because diesel costs more, that is all the same tax, assessed by geography and geopolitics, collected by no government and returned to no citizen. The disruptions represent a major supply shock, pushing prices up while weighing on demand. The strain is also visible across financial markets. As uncertainty rises, investors are shifting away from riskier assets, selling stocks, bonds, and currencies in developing countries. The capital flight from developing markets is the dimension of this crisis that is least covered and most consequential for the trajectory of the 21st century. Because developing countries, in Africa, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, are being hit by a triple burden simultaneously: higher energy import costs, higher food import costs, and tightening financial conditions as capital retreats to perceived safe havens. People in low-income developing countries are most at risk when prices rise because food accounts for about 43% of consumption on average, compared with 25% in emerging market economies and 12% in advanced economies. The instability that follows from that kind of economic stress does not stay neatly contained within borders. It produces political fragility, migration pressure, regime change, and the kind of long-term geopolitical disorder that ultimately cost the United States far more than any military campaign. What is happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now is not just about oil. It is not just about Iran and America's unfinished business with its nuclear program. It is a test of whether the international order that was constructed after World War II, premised on freedom of the seas, open trade, and American military primacy, can survive contact with a determined regional power willing to impose catastrophic costs on the global economy to resist that order. And the answer to that test is being written right now, in those narrow miles of water, one ship attack at a time.